In 1932, no pocket lighter on the market could do two things at once. It could not be elegant and reliable in the same breath. A lighter refined enough to look at home in a gentleman's palm at a restaurant table used an open flame, and an open flame died in a stiff breeze off any street corner. A lighter built to survive real wind, wrapped the flame in a clumsy metal hood, needed both hands to strike, and looked more like a piece of plumbing than something a person would want to be seen using. Every manufacturer in the business had made peace with that trade off. Matches worked well enough, but they were cheap, disposable, and just as useless in real wind, and a cigarette that would not light was a small but constant irritation for the tens of millions of Americans who smoked every single day. Nobody was racing to solve the underlying problem properly, least of all in 1932. In the fourth year of the worst economic collapse the country had ever seen, when the entire idea of a premium pocket accessory looked like a bad joke. Unemployment in the United States that year sat near 25%. Wages for the people still working had been cut again and again. Consumer goods companies were shrinking their products and cheapening their materials, chasing the nickel and the dime, because that was where the customers who remained still had money to spend. Into that climate, the idea of selling a metal lighter backed by a promise to repair it forever, for free, no questions asked, priced well above a pack of matches or a cheap tin sparker, was not a business plan. It was closer to a dare. Nobody serious was making that bet in 1932. A hardware salesman in a small Pennsylvania oil town was about to make it anyway. His name was George Grant Blaisdell, born June 5th, 1895, in Bradford, Pennsylvania, a town that had boomed decades earlier as one of the richest oil-producing places in the country, and had since settled into a steadier, harder-working kind of city, full of machine shops and refineries and people who valued something that simply worked over something that merely looked impressive. He hated formal schooling and made no secret of it, walking out of grade school years before most boys his age and refusing to go back. His father shipped him off to a military academy instead. 2 years later, the academy sent him home again, and nobody ever recorded exactly why. What is recorded is what happened next. His family put him to work in the family's own machine shop, Blaisdell Machinery Company, where he spent his early adulthood learning tools, metal, and how to sell things to people who didn't necessarily want to buy them. There was no aviation laboratory, no engineering degree, no corporate empire behind him. There was a small town machine shop and a restless, self taught tinkerer who liked solving practical problems more than he liked sitting in a classroom. The idea found him, rather than the other way around, on the porch of the Bradford Country Club sometime in 1932. A local businessman named Dick Dresser was lighting a cigarette with an odd looking imported lighter, and Blaisdell needled him about it. A man dressed that well, carrying something that ugly. In a social world where pulling out a lighters in front of other people happened almost as often as pulling out a wallet, appearance mattered nearly as much as function, and Dresser's lighter clearly failed on the first count. The dresser didn't disagree about the looks. He just held it up and made clear that it worked, wind or no wind. The lighter had come from Austria. It used a small metal chimney around the wick that let a flame breathe while blocking the gusts that killed every other lighter on the market. It was also bulky, dented easily, and needed two hands to open and strike. Blaisdell watched his friend struggle with it and saw, underneath the clumsiness, a genuinely good idea trapped inside a badly made object. His first move was not to invent anything. It was to become a middleman. Blaisdell secured the rights to bring the Austrian lighters into the United States, importing them for around 12 cents a piece and pricing them to sell for $1. It didn't work. Customers took one look at the clunky case and the two-handed operation and passed. The flaw wasn't the mechanism. The flaw was everything wrapped around the mechanism, and no amount of salesmanship was going to talk Americans into carrying something ugly and awkward, wind-resistant or not. The importing venture failed quickly. It also taught Blaisdell exactly what needed fixing and exactly what didn't. So he decided to stop selling someone else's compromise and build his own. Late in 1932, With the country nowhere near recovery and most businessmen telling him to wait for better times, Blaisdell set out to design a lighter from nothing. Something that kept the one part of the Austrian design that actually worked and threw out everything else. The part worth keeping was obvious: the chimney. That perforated metal hood around the wick was the entire reason the Austrian lighter survived outdoors when every sleek American lighter failed in the wind. The holes punched around its sides let enough air reach the wick to keep the flame fed while blocking the direct force of a gust. Everything else had to change. The case needed to be small enough and light enough to disappear into a pocket. The lid needed a hinge, not a separate removable cap that could be dropped, lost, or fumbled with two cold hands. And the whole thing needed to open, light, and close using nothing but a single thumb in one fluid motion, the way a person would actually use it in real life, at a bar, in the wind, in a hurry. Then, Blaisdell made the choice that would define the company more than any hinge or chimney ever could. Every rational instinct in Depression era retail said to make the product cheaper, simpler, and more disposable, to compete on price the way the rest of the shrinking market was competing. Blaisdell went the other direction. He priced his lighter at $1.95, several times what a basic lighter or a box of matches cost, and then he backed it with an open-ended promise no competitor was foolish enough to make. If it ever stopped working, for any reason, at any point in its life, he would fix it or replace it at no charge. Forever. Not a 90-day warranty, not a 1-year guarantee with fine print. Established manufacturers with boards of directors to answer to would never have signed off on a promise that open-ended. It was a commitment only an owner betting his own name, with nobody above him to say no, could make. A standing, unconditional promise that turned every unit he sold into a liability he would personally carry for the rest of his life. It was a strange kind of confidence, betting an entire company on a mechanism never failing badly enough to bankrupt him one repair at a time, and it meant building something genuinely serviceable rather than sealed shut. A machine meant to be opened, refueled, and repaired again and again rather than thrown away. That single decision, made in the depths of the Depression, would still be paying dividends and collecting costs decades later. Turning the idea into an object happened in a rented upstairs space above the Rickerson and Pride building in downtown Bradford, with a staff of 3, an electric hot plate for soldering, and a collection of second-hand tools. Blaisdell and his small team hand-built a rectangular brass case with soldered seams and squared corners, fitted a chrome hinge to the lid, and preserved the perforated chimney from the design he had admired on that country club porch. Every early unit was essentially handmade, shaped and tested and adjusted by trial and error rather than by an engineering department. Because there was no engineering department. There was only a machine shop kid from a town that ran on oil money, betting his family's tools and his own stubbornness against the entire logic of the moment. He needed a name, and the story of how he found one is almost too simple to be a legend. Blaisdell liked the sound of the word zipper. Still a relatively new bit of American slang for the sliding fastener catching on across the fashion world that decade. He turned the word over, clipped it, reshaped it, until he landed on Zippo, a name with no real meaning that simply sounded modern, mechanical, and quick, the way the lighter itself was supposed to feel in your hand. The first Zippo lighter sold in 1933 for $1.95, backed by that unconditional lifetime promise. Blaisdell filed for a patent in May of 1934. It was granted in March of 1936, patent number 2,032,695. That very first production lighter still exists today, on permanent display back in Bradford. For years, almost nobody outside a small radius of Pennsylvania had ever heard of it. The company's real break came when the Kendall Refining Company, also based in Bradford, placed an order for 500 lighters stamped with its own logo, the first corporate order Zippo ever filled, and proof that the idea could survive contact with an actual customer base beyond friends and neighbors. Dealers leaned into a simple, theatrical sales pitch. Hold a lit Zippo in front of an electric fan in full view of a skeptical customer and let the flame do the convincing. It became known as the fan test, and it sold lighters one skeptical bystander at a time. Around the same period, the company began offering to engrave a customer's initials onto the case for an extra dollar, a small personalization option that decades later would take on a far heavier meaning on the other side of the world. By 1936, the lighter had found its way into a Minnesota mail order catalog aimed at retailers nationwide. None of this looked like the beginning of an American icon. It looked like a small town novelty company scraping by, one modest order at a time, through the tail end of the Depression. Then, in December of 1941, the United States entered a war that would remake the company overnight. Zippo stopped selling to ordinary customers entirely and handed its full production capacity to the United States military. Brass, the metal the lighter had been built from since 1932, was suddenly needed for shell casings and other military hardware, so Zippo switched its case to steel, finished in a rough, non-reflective black coating that came to be known as black crackle. The dull finish was not just a wartime substitute look. A shined brass case could catch moonlight or flare light and give away a soldier's position in the dark, so the ugliness turned out to be another small, functional trade-off. It was uglier than the polished brass original. It was also, almost instantly, everywhere. Millions of American servicemen carried a Zippo into basic training, onto transport ships, and into combat across Europe and the Pacific. And the small Bradford novelty company that had barely survived the 1930s became, within a few years, a name recognized by an entire generation of American men who had never once set foot in Pennsylvania. The lighter earned its reputation the hard way, in conditions no laboratory back home could ever have simulated. Soldiers used it to heat cans of rations when there was no fire to be had, to read maps and gauges in blacked out cockpits and foxholes, and simply to keep a cigarette lit in weather that killed every disposable match within seconds. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent whose dispatches from the front lines were read across the entire country, singled the lighter out in his own reporting as one of the single most envied possessions any enlisted man could carry. And he and Blaisdell kept up a personal correspondence throughout the war, with Blaisdell mailing him 50 to 100 lighters a month to hand out personally to the troops he was covering. When Pyle was killed by machine gun fire on a small island near Okinawa in the spring of 1945, Blaisdell was reportedly devastated, having lost not just a customer, but something closer to a partner in getting his invention into the hands of the men who needed it most. Stories circulated of dented, scorched lighters pulled from wrecked jeeps and abandoned foxholes that still lit on the very first try, and each story did more for the company's reputation than any advertisement Blaisdell could ever have bought. The lifetime guarantee, the strange promise made in a Depression-era workshop, had now been tested by combat itself, and it had held. But the same decision that built that legend carried a quieter cost, one that had nothing to do with combat at all. The chimney that let a Zippo's flame survive a hurricane-force wind worked precisely because the lighter was not sealed. Air moved freely in and out of that case, which meant the lighter fluid moved out right along with it, evaporating steadily whether the lighter was in use or sitting untouched in a drawer. A Zippo, left alone for a couple of weeks, would run bone dry entirely on its own, guarantee or no guarantee. The same openness that made it nearly impossible to extinguish outdoors made it a small, ongoing chore indoors. Flints to replace, wicks to trim, fuel to top off again and again, a machine that demanded a little bit of attention forever in exchange for never quite dying. For a soldier who treated the lighter as a piece of personal gear worth maintaining, that trade felt like nothing at all. For an ordinary customer back home who just wanted a light for a cigarette and nothing more to think about, it was about to become a real liability. The war ended. The company boomed through peacetime, built a novelty car shaped like a giant Zippo lighter to tour the country in 1947, and rolled a slimmer model onto shelves aimed at women in 1956. A second patent in 1950 locked in mechanical refinements that left the lighter's basic design essentially frozen from that point forward, right down to the version sold today. and a small date code stamped on the bottom of every case. Originally added for quality control, later let collectors trace any individual lighter back to the exact year it left the factory. Decades went by. And somewhere in that long peacetime run, the entire logic that had built the company, a durable, serviceable object you kept for life, collided head on with a culture that increasingly wanted the opposite, something you never thought about at all. The first sign came from a lighter that needed no chimney, no hinge, and no flint replacement. Gillette's Cricket, built on a European design and pushed hard into American stores in the early 1970s, was cheap, plastic, and meant to be thrown in the trash the moment it stopped working. It didn't out-engineer the Zippo. It didn't even try to beat it in the wind. It simply proved something Bradford had not fully reckoned with yet. Given the choice, a large share of ordinary smokers didn't actually want a lighter they would maintain for the rest of their lives. They wanted one they would never have to think about again, and they were willing to give up windproof reliability and lifetime repair to get it. The company that turned that appetite into an industry was Bic, a large French manufacturer that had already spent 2 decades mastering high precision, high volume plastic molding on its ballpoint pens. Bic's engineers were not trying to build a better version of a Zippo. They were solving an entirely different problem: how to manufacture a lighter with no serviceable parts at all, sealed shut, that would still reliably strike 3,000 times in a row before it ran dry and got thrown away. That meant treating disposability itself as the design goal rather than the design flaw, with precision molded plastic housings, consistent butane metering, and a flint and striker wheel engineered to survive exactly as long as the fuel inside and not 1 day longer. Bic treated the lighter the same way it treated its ballpoint pens, as a precision manufactured consumable built to a price point, not a keepsake built to a promise. It was the mirror image of everything Blaisdell had built. Where Zippo had bet on a machine you fixed forever, Bic bet on a machine engineered to die on schedule, cheaply enough that dying on schedule simply did not matter. Bic brought that machine to the American market in 1973, priced at $1.49, in 5 simple colors, backed by a national ad campaign that told people to flick their Bic and stop thinking about it altogether. Within a decade, the disposable lighter had done to the everyday cigarette lighter market roughly what cheap wristwatches had done to fine ones. It did not kill the premium version, but it utterly conquered the mass market occasion the premium version used to own outright. By the 21st century, Bic alone had sold more than 30 billion lighters worldwide. The pack of cigarettes, light it and forget it customer, the person who simply wanted fire in their pocket and nothing more, was gone for good. And no amount of craftsmanship was ever going to win that specific customer back. Zippo tried, in its own way, to compete on that ground. It eventually released a butane-powered multi-purpose lighter of its own, aimed at candles and grills and everyday utility use rather than nostalgia. But the company never seriously chased the bottom of the disposable market, and by the time it might have wanted to, the ground was already gone. The everyday, throwaway occasion belonged to somebody else now, permanently, and pretending otherwise would have meant abandoning the very promise the whole company had been built on in the first place. Underneath all of it, an even bigger shift was working against the entire category. In 1965, more than 4 in every 10 American adults smoked cigarettes. By the early 2020s, that figure had fallen to roughly 1 in 9, driven down by decades of public health warnings, advertising bans, workplace and restaurant smoking restrictions, and the rise of vaping as an alternative habit entirely. The original reason a person needed a pocket lighter at all, to light a cigarette reliably, several times a day, for years, was quietly disappearing out from underneath the entire industry, Zippo included. The object that had once been defined entirely by that single daily ritual increasingly found itself being carried by people who had never smoked a cigarette in their lives: campers lighting stoves, collectors chasing rare finishes, cannabis users after recreational legalization spread state by state, and people who simply liked the weight of real metal and the specific recognizable click of a lid that no plastic disposable could ever quite reproduce. The lighter had outlived the very habit it was built to serve, an unusual kind of survival in which the object kept thriving long after the original reason for inventing it had quietly moved on without it. Even as its original purpose thinned out from underneath it, the sheer scale of what had been built kept climbing anyway. By 2012, its 80th anniversary year, the company had produced its 500 millionth lighter. By the mid 2020s, that lifetime total had passed 650 million, every one of them still finished by hand in Bradford, every one of them still covered by the same unconditional promise Blaisdell had made back in 1932. Nobody occupied Bradford. No outside government forced Zippo's factory into different hands. But the compounding pressure of the disposable lighter invasion and the decades long collapse in smoking rates amounted to the closest thing the company would ever face to an existential threat. A slow, grinding erosion of the exact customer base the entire business had been built around, arriving from two directions at once, with no single dramatic battle to win or lose. Surviving it was going to require becoming something more than just a lighter company. So it did. In 1993, Zippo acquired Case Cutlery, a Pennsylvania knife maker with roots stretching back to 1889, bringing a second serious American craft, hand-finished blades instead of hand-finished lighters, under the same corporate roof, often quite literally the same town. In the years that followed, the company added Northern Lights Candles, a maker of luxury candles based just across the New York state line. A line of men's and women's fragrances sold under the Zippo name, hand warmers fueled by the same lighter fluid the company had always sold, and starting in 2013, a full line of outdoor and camping gear built for people who wanted fire in the woods, not just fire in a pocket. The company also picked up the trademark rights to Ronson, an old rival lighter brand, folding a former competitor's name onto its own growing shelf, and kept finding small, playful ways to stay culturally relevant, from novelty lighter collaborations with a refrigerated pickle brand to limited run designs timed for cannabis culture holidays as more states legalized recreational use. None of it replaced the lighter. All of it leaned on the same manufacturing discipline, the same brand trust, and the same small town workforce that had been soldering brass cases together since the 1930s, just pointed at new targets. George Blaisdell did not live to see most of that reinvention happen. He died on October the 3rd, 1978, only 5 years after Bic's disposable lighter had landed on American shelves and permanently changed the market he had built his career inside. Ownership passed to his two daughters, Harriet Wick and Sarah Dawn, and by the 1980s, the company was held collectively by 6 members of the extended Blaisdell family. The hardest stretch of adaptation, watching disposables swallow the everyday market, watching smoking rates fall year after year, deciding what the company would become next, happened almost entirely without him, under leadership that had inherited his name and his promise but not his original blueprint for what came after. Eventually, ownership consolidated into a single pair of hands. George Duke, Blaisdell's grandson, became sole owner and chairman of the board, with day-to-day leadership handed to a company veteran, Mark Paup, who became president and CEO after more than 2 decades inside the business. Under that stewardship, the Case relationship deepened rather than staying a simple acquisition on paper. In 1997, the company opened a combined Zippo and Case museum in Bradford, a physical building where the lighter's history and the knife maker's history sat under one 15,000 square foot roof, a public statement that the two crafts were now permanently linked together. That second act grew steadily rather than explosively. Case built a genuine reputation among collectors and outdoorsmen as a serious American knife brand in its own right. The broader Zippo portfolio expanded into India and China through the early 2000 teens, part of a wider push that helped the company post record sales in 2011 and 2012, even as its core American smoking customer base kept on shrinking. By the mid-2020s, products carrying the Zippo name, in one form or another, were being sold in more than 160 countries. A footprint of the original 3-employee workshop above a Bradford storefront could never have imagined. Unlike an inventor pushed out of the field he had built, Blaisdell never had to leave it at all. He stayed personally involved with the company and with his hometown for the rest of his life. He funded and maintained a public ski slope for Bradford residents through the 1940s. He made sure the words Bradford, Pennsylvania, were stamped on the bottom of every single lighter the company ever produced, a small, permanent signature tying the product back to the town that made it. He is remembered locally not only as the man who invented the lighter, but as a boss who reportedly put his employees and his town ahead of his own bank account, chartering entire trains so his workers could see the ice follies in Buffalo, and insisting on more than one occasion that without the people of Bradford, there would have been no Zippo at all. Even after the company had long since outgrown a one man operation, he kept traveling personally to retail stores around the country to shake hands and make the case for his lighter himself, well past the point a sales staff could have handled it for him. George Blaisdell died at 78 on October 3rd, 1978, in the same town where he had been born, run his machine shop, and built his lighter company from 3 employees into an American institution. A Bradford elementary school was later named in his honor. The business passed, as planned, into the hands of his own family, and has stayed there, structurally at least, ever since, a rare thing for any company approaching its 100th year, let alone one that survived the exact kind of market collapse that has erased countless other manufacturers along the way. The lighter itself, meanwhile, kept building a cultural life that had almost nothing to do with its inventor personally. It went on to appear in more than 2,000 films, television shows, and stage productions, and its distinctive metallic click became recognizable enough on its own that people could identify the brand by sound alone, in the dark, without ever seeing the case at all. It became a fixture at rock concerts through the 1960s and the 1970s, raised and flicked open as a makeshift salute long before smartphone flashlights took over that same ritual. And in Vietnam, it became something far more complicated than a product. Soldiers personalized millions of them with engraved slogans, jokes, prayers, and protest messages scratched into the chrome, turning individual lighters into small, private diaries carried into a war most of them had never chosen. Those same lighters, and the men carrying them, were also present at some of the war's darkest and most controversial moments, including the 1965 television footage of American troops setting fire to a Vietnamese village, a broadcast that shocked the country and permanently complicated how Americans would remember the object. Decades later, the writer Sherry Buchanan gathered hundreds of these engraved wartime lighters, drawn largely from a private collection assembled by the artist Bradford Edwards, into a 2007 book that treated them as a genuine historical archive, proof that a small manufactured object, mass-produced in rural Pennsylvania, had somehow become one of the most intimate surviving records of what an entire generation of American soldiers actually felt. Today, Zippo Manufacturing Company still operates out of Bradford, Pennsylvania, the same small city where George Blaisdell was born, in a plant employing several hundred people, some of whom finish and inspect lighters using techniques barely changed from the ones Blaisdell's original 3-person crew used with a hot plate and second-hand tools. The company remains privately held by the Blaisdell family, still guarantees every lighter for life, still stamps every case with the town's name, and still turns out limited edition designs for holidays, anniversaries, and pop culture collaborations that have nothing to do with cigarettes at all. It owns a respected American knife maker, a candle company, a fragrance line, and outdoor gear sold on nearly every continent on Earth. At a time when most of its remaining competitors in the lighter business manufacture overseas, the company still leans hard on one detail in nearly everything it publishes. Every Zippo lighter sold anywhere in the world is still built entirely in Bradford, not licensed out and not assembled elsewhere, in the same small city where the whole idea began on a country club porch in 1932. The flame Blaisdell first shielded behind a borrowed Austrian chimney design in a rented Bradford workshop in 1932 is, in a very literal sense, still burning, 90 plus years and roughly 650 million lighters later. The Zippo was never the cheapest lighter on the market, and after 1973, it was never again the most convenient one either. Both of those losses trace back to the exact same decision Blaisdell made in the depths of the Depression. Build something meant to be opened, repaired, and kept, rather than something meant to be used up once and thrown away. That decision is what let a small-town machine shop kid's stubborn gamble survive a world war, a cultural revolution in how Americans smoked, and the total collapse of its own original customer base, at a time when countless larger, better funded competitors simply vanished without a trace. The lighter's genius and its limitations were never two separate things. They were the identical choice, made once, on a country club porch in 1932, and never seriously reconsidered since. Everything else, the war, the guarantee, the disposable rival that finally outcompeted it on price, the knives and candles and fragrances that kept the lights on afterward, was just that one decision, playing itself out one flicked lid at a time for nearly a century. 90 some years later, the flame itself has never needed reinventing. Only everything standing around it has.